So, when you hear the word Neanderthal, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, for a long, long time, it was this brutish, hunched over caveman, right? Well, modern science has totally, and I mean radically, updated that picture. So let's dig into the evidence that's completely rewriting the story of our closest extinct relatives. Okay, look at this. On the left, yep, there's your classic caricature. But on the right, that's a modern reconstruction, and it's based on decades of actual fossil evidence. And this isn't just some artistic makeover, you know? This contrast forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew, which leads us to the central question of this entire investigation. And that really is the big question. See, everyone alive on the planet today were all classified as Homo sapiens. But should Neanderthals be in that club with us? Or are they a completely separate species? To answer that, we've got to look at the evidence, starting with the original, old-school case against them. All right, so let's start with the classic argument, the reason scientists for over a century thought of them as totally different. And it all came down to anatomy, just what we could see and measure from their bones. Just take a look at these skulls. On the left, you've got a Homo sapiens skull. See how it's high and rounded, almost like a ball. They actually call it globular. But then you look at the Neanderthal skull on the right, it's longer, it's slower, and it's got that classic heavy brow ridge. I mean, you don't need to be a paleontologist to see these are just fundamentally different shapes. And the differences go way deeper than just the skull. Neanderthals had a wider pelvis, and even the tiny, tiny bones inside their ears were a different shape from ours. Now, when you find these same distinct traits in fossils spread across tens of thousands of years, it really suggests a long, separate evolutionary path. So, based on all this, scientists were pretty confident. They named them a separate species, Homo neanderthalensis. And for a long, long time, that was pretty much the end of the story. But then, genetics came along and just blew everything up. So just when that whole anatomical story seemed completely locked down, genetics came along and threw this massive, massive wrench in the works. Okay, to really get why this was such a big deal, we need to talk about something called the biological species concept. It's a really fundamental idea in biology, and it basically says this: a species is any group of living things that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. In other words, if they can have babies and then those babies can grow up and have their own babies, well, they're the same species. So, when scientists were finally able to analyze DNA from ancient Neanderthal bones, they found something absolutely astonishing. It turns out, when our Homo sapiens ancestors migrated out of Africa about 50,000 years ago and ran into Neanderthals, they had children together. Yeah, you heard that right. In fact, if your family tree has roots anywhere outside of sub-Saharan Africa, you probably have around 2% Neanderthal DNA in your own genome, right now. That means their genetic legacy isn't just some fossil in a museum. It's literally walking around inside billions of us today, influencing everything from how our immune system works to our skin pigmentation. So that brings us right back to that biological species concept, doesn't it? I mean, if we could interbreed, and we know for a fact we did, and produced fertile kids, doesn't that kind of mean we have to be the same species? This discovery just completely blew the whole debate wide open again. And believe it or not, the surprises didn't stop with genetics. In recent years, the evidence for their intelligence, for their culture, has just exploded. And it's forcing us to totally rethink the Neanderthal mind. Okay, check out this timeline, because it really shows how innovative they were. We're talking 176,000 years ago. That's way, way before modern humans ever set foot in Europe. Neanderthals were going deep inside a French cave and building these complex rings out of stalactites. Fast forward over 100,000 years, and now they're painting on cave walls in Spain. And here's the kicker. They did all of this completely on their own. You know, this isn't just about making a sharp rock. This is evidence of serious planning, cooperation, and something we call symbolic thought, the ability to make one thing stand for something else. This is basically art. It's architecture. These are absolutely not the actions of some simple-minded brute. They were so much more like us than we ever imagined. Okay, so if they weren't dumb, and we know we're related, then what really set us apart? Well, the latest research is pointing not so much to intelligence, but to having very different strategies for survival. And this table here really breaks down a key difference. When scientists studied their teeth, it shows that Neanderthals were what you might call reactive. They were opportunists. So if they were in open country, they ate meat. When the forests grew back, they switched over to plants. Early modern humans, on the other hand, we were more proactive. We used increasingly complex technology and tools to get the food we wanted, pretty much no matter what the environment was. So what this really suggests is that it wasn't some simple contest of who was smarter. Instead, it's a story of two different and, for a long time, equally successful strategies for adapting and surviving in a really harsh, changing world. All right, so let's try to put all these pieces together. We've got this distinct anatomy, right? But we also have shared DNA. We've got clear evidence of complex culture and these different survival strategies. So where does all that leave us on our big question? Well, Professor Chris Stringer, who's a leading expert at the Natural History Museum, really sums up the modern scientific consensus. Think of it like this: polar bears and grizzly bears. We think of them as different species, right? But they can have fertile cubs together. The argument here is that 500,000 years of evolving separately, long enough to create those really distinct skulls, pelvises, and ear bones, is enough to classify Neanderthals as their own species, Homo neanderthalensis. And that, of course, leads to the final mystery. If they were so smart and so capable, why did they disappear? For a long time, the simple answer was that we, Homo sapiens, just showed up and outcompeted them. You know, a prehistoric battle of the wits that we won. But today, most experts don't really buy that simple competition story anymore. It's been replaced by what you could call a demographic story. The evidence now suggests Neanderthals lived in much smaller, more isolated groups. So when these huge waves of far more numerous Homo sapiens started arriving from Africa, the Neanderthals weren't really outsmarted. They were just outnumbered. It wasn't a war they lost. It was a numbers game. And slowly but surely, they were just kind of absorbed into this much, much larger human gene pool. And that's really the ultimate takeaway here. Neanderthals were a distinct lineage, different enough for us to call them another species. And yet, because we interbred, they never really truly vanished. A piece of them literally lives on inside so many of us today. Their story makes our own story so much more complex, and it really forces us to ask a much bigger, much deeper question. What does it truly mean to be human?